Imagine being 12 years old, still playing with dolls and dreaming of childhood adventures. Now picture a world where, almost overnight, your life is decided for you, your future mapped out by others, and your every choice erased. A world where your wedding day isn't a distant dream, but a looming reality, perhaps even before you reach your teenage years. Welcome to 560 at Vaughn. Number 11. Your entire future was not your own to choose. In the year 560, and if you were a young girl, the concept of personal choice in marriage simply did not exist. Your future, particularly who you would spend the rest of your life with, was not a decision you would make for yourself. It was a careful negotiation, a strategic alliance, or a necessary transaction conducted by your parents or male guardians. Think of it less like a romantic partnership and more like a merger between two families, or even two powerful political entities. Your feelings, your hopes, your dreams for a partner were, quite frankly, irrelevant to the grand scheme of things. Consider a young girl named Helena growing up in a prosperous merchant family in Constantinople, the bustling capital of the Byzantine Empire. Helena might have spent her days learning embroidery, assisting her mother with household management, or perhaps even getting a rudimentary education in reading and writing, depending on her family's status. She would have heard whispers of marriages being arranged for older cousins, of dowries being discussed, of families rising or falling based on the marital alliances they forged. Yet, the moment the discussions turned to her, her own desires were silenced. Her father, a shrewd businessman, would be looking for a match that brought more prestige, more wealth, or a stronger connection to the imperial court. He might consider a son from another wealthy merchant family to expand their trade network, or perhaps a minor nobleman to elevate their social standing. Helena would be informed of the decision, not consulted. It was often presented as a done deal, a matter of family duty and destiny. Across the sprawling Roman Empire, which, in 560 AD was primarily the Eastern or Byzantine Empire, the legal frameworks often supported this lack of agency. While the Justinian Code, a collection of laws codified earlier in the 6th century, outlined various aspects of marriage, it largely assumed parental consent as the primary mechanism for a lawful union, especially for minors. A girl was often legally considered under the patria potestas, the absolute authority of her father, until she married, and even then her legal standing was largely tied to her husband. Her consent, if even sought, was often a mere formality, a quiet nod under the watchful eyes of her elders. The concept of free will in marriage, as we understand it today, was a radical, almost unthinkable notion for a girl of that era. Imagine the crushing weight of this reality. One day, you are a child, innocent and relatively carefree within the confines of your home. The next you are told you are to be wed to a man you have never met, whose reputation might be vague whispers in the marketplace, or whose family background is merely a name uttered by your father. There was no opportunity to date, to get to know someone, to build a connection. There was no space for youthful infatuation or the blossoming of affection. Your marriage was a contract, signed and sealed, long before your own heart had a chance to speak. This decision, made entirely by others, would dictate your home, your daily life, your social standing, and indeed the very trajectory of your entire existence. The idea of running away, of defying your parents, was not only socially catastrophic but practically impossible. Leaving a girl with nowhere to go and no means of support in a society that offered few avenues for independent women. Your life was not a story, you wrote. It was a carefully pre-written scroll unrolled by the hands of your elders. Number 10. Your childhood disappeared the moment you were betrothed. For a young girl in 560 AD, the announcement of a betrothal was not just a step towards adulthood. It was a sudden, jarring termination of childhood itself. One day, you might be playing with your younger siblings, dreaming of simple things, and the next, you were expected to begin preparing for the gravest responsibilities of a wife. The transition was often abrupt, with little time for emotional adjustment. Concept of a prolonged adolescence or a period of youthful exploration simply did not exist for girls who were destined for marriage. Take the example of a young girl named Theron, living in the countryside of Gaul, a region still recovering from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and now populated by emerging Germanic kingdoms like the Franks. Theron might have spent her days helping her mother in the fields, tending to animals, or learning the practical skills necessary for managing a household, spinning wool, grinding grain, preparing simple meals. These were the tasks of a child learning to be a woman, but they were still framed within the relatively protected sphere of her family. When her father, perhaps a small landholder, announced her betrothal to the son of a neighboring, more powerful family, her world would have shifted seismically. Suddenly the games stopped. The innocent chatter quieted. The focus turned entirely to her future role as a wife, and, more importantly, a mother. The expectations placed upon her would have changed overnight. She would be instructed more intensely in the duties of a mistress of a household, from managing servants and finances to understanding the intricacies of the new family she was about to join. Her education, if she had any, would cease to be about general knowledge and would focus entirely on domesticity and procreation. Her demeanor would be scrutinized. She would be expected to show modesty, obedience, and a serious understanding of the gravity of her upcoming role. Laughter might be tempered, playful gestures restrained. There was an unspoken urgency to transform her from a carefree child into a responsible woman who could uphold the honor and interests of two families. In the Byzantine Empire, where girls were often betrothed as young as 7 and married around 12 or 14 years old, this sudden end to childhood was even more pronounced. A girl might be married, theoretically, at a very young age, even if the consummation was delayed until puberty. But the moment the betrothal was announced, she was no longer seen as a child. She was a future wife, a future mother, a vessel for the continuation of a family line. Her interactions with male family members, even her own father, might become more formalized. She would be seen as a commodity, a valuable asset being transferred from one family to another and treated with a solemnity that belied her tender years. The emotional toll of this sudden transition was immense. Imagine leaving behind the innocent joy of childhood, the comfort of familiar routines, and the safety of your mother's direct care, to step into the demanding and unfamiliar role of a wife. There was no gradual easing into adulthood, no time for self-discovery or personal growth before being thrust into the responsibilities of marriage and potential motherhood. Your days of playing with makeshift toys, exploring the outdoors, or simply being a child were over. The expectation was that you would immediately assume the mantle of womanhood, a mantle that often felt heavy and ill-fitting on such young shoulders. The abruptness of this shift left many young girls feeling bewildered, scared, and forced to grow up at an astonishing, often painful pace. Number 9, your value was often tied to the dowry you brought. In 560 AD, the concept of a dowry was not merely a tradition. It was a foundational pillar of marriage across many societies, from the bustling cities of the Byzantine Empire to the nascent kingdoms of Western Europe and beyond. For a young girl, this meant that her worth in the marriage market was often inextricably linked to the wealth, property, or goods her family could provide as a dowry. She was not just a bride. She was a package deal, and the value of that package largely determined the quality of her match. Consider the family of a young girl named Lydia, in a flourishing port city in North Africa, then part of the Byzantine Empire. Her father was a moderately successful merchant, and he desperately wanted his daughter to marry into a more prestigious family, perhaps one with connections to shipping magnates or even imperial officials. To secure such a match, he would need to assemble a substantial dowry. This could consist of gold coins, silver ornaments, expensive silks, fertile land, or even slaves. The larger and more impressive the dowry, the more attractive Lydia would be as a potential bride to families seeking to expand their own wealth and influence. The dowry was a complex economic instrument. For the Brooms family, it represented an infusion of wealth that could be used to acquire more land, fund business ventures, or simply increase their overall standing. It also served as a form of security for the bride, theoretically providing her with a certain degree of financial protection should her husband die, or in rare cases if the marriage dissolved. However, the dowry often remained under the husband's control during the marriage, and while it was meant to revert to the wife if she became a widow, its actual retrieval could be fraught with difficulties. For families with multiple daughters, arranging marriages could be an enormous financial burden. A father might spend years accumulating resources to provide adequate dowries for all his girls, sometimes even going into debt or selling off valuable assets. This pressure meant that the prospect of a daughter's marriage was often viewed through a financial lens long before any personal considerations came into play. A girl from a wealthy family with a large dowry could expect to marry into a family of similar or higher standing, enjoying a life of relative comfort. A girl from a poor family with a small or non-existent dowry faced a much bleaker outlook. Her options would be limited, perhaps to a less desirable match, or even no match at all, leading to a life of spinsterhood which carried considerable social stigma. Imagine the psychological impact on a young girl. From an early age, she would be aware of her family's financial situation and the constant discussions about dowries. She might overhear her parents lamenting their inability to provide a grand dowry for her or her sisters, understanding implicitly that this diminished her prospects. Her worth was not solely based on her character, her beauty, or her skills, but on the tangible assets she represented. This reduced her to an economic variable, a piece in a larger financial puzzle. The societal message was clear. Your value as a woman, your ability to secure a good future, was directly correlated with the size of the gift your family could bestow upon your husband. It was a stark reminder that you were not entering a partnership as an equal, but as an asset, albeit one with a price tag attached. Number 8. You were often expected to marry a complete stranger. One of the most unsettling realities for a young girl entering an arranged marriage in 560 AD was the very high probability that her future husband would be a complete stranger to her. The idea of getting to know your spouse before your wedding day, of building a friendship or a romantic connection, was a luxury almost unheard of, especially for girls. These marriages were not about personal affinity. They were about family reputation, economic advantage, political alliances, or simply social convention. Consider a young girl named Clara, living in a small village nestled in the newly forming Lombard kingdom in what is now Italy. Her family might have been farmers, perhaps, with a bit of land and a few animals. Her father, looking to secure the family's position, or perhaps to protect their land from rival clans, might seek a marriage alliance with a neighboring village or even a family from a few days' travel away. The negotiations would take place between the fathers, perhaps through intermediaries, with the girls often remaining entirely ignorant of the discussions until the agreement was finalized. Clara might hear whispers of a potential groom, perhaps his family's name, or that he was known to be a strong warrior or a diligent farmer. But a face, a voice, a personality, those would remain unknown until the day of the wedding, or perhaps a formal introduction shortly before this meeting was rarely a relaxed affair. It was typically a solemn occasion designed to confirm the match and ensure both parties were physically acceptable. For the young girl, it meant being presented to a man who would soon hold dominion over her life, a man whose age, temperament, and character were a complete mystery. He might be significantly older than her, perhaps a widower with children, or simply a man she found intimidating or unpleasant. There was no recourse, no polite way to decline the match if you felt an instant aversion. Your family's honor and the terms of the agreement were paramount. In more aristocratic circles, especially within the Byzantine Empire, girls might be betrothed and married to individuals from distant provinces or even foreign lands solely for strategic political reasons. Imagine a young noblewoman, perhaps named Sophia, from a prominent family in Antioch. Her family might arrange her marriage to a young man from the imperial court in Constantinople, or even to a chieftain from a neighboring kingdom to secure a peace treaty or a trade route. Sophia might have only seen a small portrait of her future husband, or perhaps just heard vague descriptions. Her journey to meet him would be long and arduous, leading her to a completely unfamiliar environment, new customs, and a household of strangers, all under the authority of a man she had never spoken a word to. The psychological impact of marrying a stranger was profound. It meant stepping into the most intimate of relationships with someone whose habits, kindness, or cruelty were completely unknown. There was no foundation of trust, no shared history, no personal affection to smooth over the inevitable difficulties of married life. You were essentially embarking on a lifelong journey with someone who was at best a blank slate, and at worst, a terrifying unknown. Pressure to adapt, to please, and to live harmoniously with this stranger was immense, and the lack of any prior connection made the transition into wifehood an even more isolating and frightening experience. Your future was a leap of faith into the arms of someone whose very existence had been irrelevant to you until the moment he became your husband. Number 7. Your primary purpose was to produce heirs, especially sons. In the world of 560, at the central purpose of marriage, particularly companionship or personal fulfillment, it was overwhelmingly about procreation, specifically the production of heirs, and more specifically male heirs. Your value as a wife and your security within your new household was deeply tied to your ability to bear children, and the greatest triumph was to produce a son. Consider the life of a young girl named Bridget, living in a tribal settlement in Ireland, a land of emerging Christian influence but still strong ancient customs. Her family, perhaps a lineage of local chieftains, would view her marriage as a means to secure the succession of their name and bloodline. When she married, her worth to her husband's family would be measured not by her charm or intellect, but by her fertility. The moment she entered her new home, silent expectations would weigh heavily on her. Every month, the hope for a pregnancy would loom large, and every pregnancy would be met with eager anticipation that it would yield a male child. The pressure to produce a son was immense across all strata of society, from emperors to peasants. A male heir ensured the continuation of the family name, the inheritance of property, and the stability of the lineage. Without a son, a family faced the risk of its name dying out, its lands being divided, or its power eroding. For a young wife, this meant that her position within the household was precarious until a son was born. Her husband's family might look upon her with growing disappointment or even suspicion if she produced only daughters, or worse, no children at all. Imagine the anxiety. You might be only 12 or 13 years old, still physically developing, yet you are immediately expected to become pregnant. Your body, your health, your energy would all be focused on this biological imperative. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality were tragically common in this era, making each pregnancy a tense gamble. If you lost a child, especially a son, the grief would be compounded by the crushing pressure to conceive again and succeed. The consequences of failing to produce a male heir could be severe. In some societies, a husband might be encouraged or even expected to take a second wife or a concubine to ensure the continuation of his line. While this was not uniformly legal or accepted everywhere, particularly in Christianized areas, it could happen informally, leaving the first wife feeling inadequate, rejected, and her future insecure. In other instances, a woman might be sent back to her family, a devastating disgrace that often led to financial ruin for her parents, who might have to return the dowry. Even if she remained in the household, her authority, her standing, and her personal happiness would be severely diminished if she could not fulfill her primary function. Your body was not truly your own. It was a vessel, a biological tool for the continuation of a lineage. Your purpose in life, at least in the eyes of society and your new family, was to produce the next generation, especially strong, healthy sons to carry on the family name. Every ache, every illness, every sign of delayed menstruation would be scrutinized. Your very existence in the marriage was validated by your womb and the children it could bear, particularly the male ones. It was a brutal reality that reduced a young girl to a reproductive unit, with her worth measured almost entirely by her fertility. Number 6. You were highly vulnerable to abuse and neglect. Stepping into an arranged marriage in 560 meant entering a world where a young girl's safety and well-being were often precarious, leaving her highly vulnerable to abuse and neglect. With little to no legal recourse, and the immense power imbalance inherent in the patriarchal societies of the time, a young wife's fate rested almost entirely on the character of her husband and his family. Consider a young girl named Theodora, from a modest but respectable family in a town within the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania. She is married off to an older man, a landowner from a neighboring district, whose family is known to be stern and isolated. Theodora, perhaps only 13, finds herself in a new home, far from her parents and siblings, surrounded by strangers who are now her family. Her husband might be kind or he might be cruel. He might be patient with her youth and inexperience, or he might demand instant obedience and perfection. There was no way to know until she was already there, bound by marriage. Physical abuse, sadly, was often an unspoken reality. In many legal traditions of the time, a husband had considerable authority over his wife, akin to a father's authority over his children. While outright brutality was not always sanctioned, the lines between discipline and abuse were blurred, and a wife had very few avenues for protection. There were no women's shelters, no police forces to call upon, no independent legal aid. If a husband beat his wife, it was often considered a private family matter, and intervention from outside was rare unless the abuse was exceptionally severe and public, or if her birth family was powerful enough to demand action. Even then, the goal would typically be to ensure her return to the husband, not to free her from the marriage. Beyond physical harm, neglect could be just as damaging. A young wife might find herself isolated, ignored, or emotionally abandoned. If her husband was indifferent, cruel, or if she failed to produce children quickly, she might be cast aside within the household, left to feel unwanted and alone. Her new family might treat her as a servant rather than a cherished member, demanding endless labor with little appreciation or support. Imagine being a young girl, perhaps still struggling with the transition from childhood, now feeling utterly alone and without affection in a new, unfamiliar home. The lack of options for escape made this vulnerability even more brutal. Divorce, if permitted at all, was typically far more difficult for a woman to initiate than for a man. In many Christianized regions, divorce was virtually impossible, except under very specific circumstances, like male adultery, and even then, it was rare for a woman to successfully pursue it. To flee the marriage meant becoming an outcast, a woman without protection, without social standing, and without financial means. Such a fate was often worse than remaining in an abusive situation, leaving girls trapped in circumstances that could be terrifying. The very structure of arranged marriage, in this era, with its emphasis on family alliances over personal welfare and the profound power imbalance between husband and wife, left young girls exposed. Their tender age, Their lack of experience and their complete dependence on their new family made them easy targets for exploitation or mistreatment. Their silence was often taken as consent, and their pleas often went unheard in a world where a wife's complaints against her husband were rarely given serious consideration. Their vulnerability was a direct consequence of a system that prioritized property and lineage above individual human dignity and safety. Number 5. You were separated from your family and everything familiar. For a young girl in 560, an arranged marriage often meant a profound and permanent separation from her birth family, her childhood home, and everything familiar she had ever known. Unlike today, where moving away from marriage might mean a few hours' drive, in this era it could mean days or weeks of travel, effectively severing practical ties with her past life. This geographical and emotional severance was a core brutal truth of the institution. Imagine a girl named Alara growing up in a close-knit agricultural community in the fertile lands of Egypt, then part of the Byzantine Empire. Her days would have been filled with the routines of her village, the voices of her mother and sisters, the familiar smell of their home, and the comfort of her local temple or church. When her marriage was arranged to a man from a distant village or town, perhaps across the Nile or even further afield, the journey to her new home would feel like an exile. Her wedding day, while perhaps celebrated with feasting and music, would also be a day of deep sorrow, marking her definitive departure. This departure was not a temporary visit or a casual relocation. For most young wives, it was a lifelong move. Travel was difficult. Regular visits back to her birth family would be rare, perhaps once a year if she was fortunate, or even less frequently if the distance was great or the family's resources limited. News would travel slowly, by word of mouth or infrequent messengers, leaving her feeling cut off from the lives of those she loved most. Her sisters, her childhood friends, her mother's comforting presence, all would become distant memories, replaced by a new, often bewildering environment. Her new home would be filled with new faces: her husband, his parents, his siblings, their children, and perhaps a retinue of servants or slaves. These people, formerly strangers, were now her immediate family, and she was expected to integrate it into their customs, their routines, and their hierarchy. She might find herself living under the roof of a stern mother-in-law who expected absolute obedience, or in a household with different traditions, different dialects, or even different religious practices. The sense of being an outsider, an intruder in someone else's established life, could be overwhelming. The emotional toll of this separation was immense. For a young girl, often barely a teenager, the loss of her childhood support system could lead to intense loneliness, fear, and a profound sense of displacement. She might miss the gentle guidance of her mother, the camaraderie of her sisters, or the simple familiarity of her childhood room. There was no going back. Her previous life was closed off to her. Her new identity was as her husband's wife, a member of his family, and her primary loyalty was now expected to be to them. This separation was not just about physical distance. It was about the severing of emotional bonds and the forced creation of new ones. It was a stark reminder that her life was no longer her own, but rather a piece in a larger societal puzzle moved and placed where it served the best interests of her family and her new husband's family. The familiar world she had known, with its comforting rhythms and beloved faces, simply vanished, replaced by an unknown future in a new, often isolating domain. Number 4, your rights were extremely limited, making escape almost impossible. In 560, the legal and social landscape for women, especially young married girls, was overwhelmingly structured to limit their rights and autonomy, making any form of escape from an unhappy or abusive marriage virtually impossible. The laws, customs, and societal norms of the time were designed to maintain family order and patriarchal authority, with women's individual well-being often a secondary consideration. Consider a young girl named Serena, married into a powerful landowning family in Francia. Her life is now governed by her husband's will and the traditions of his household. If her husband were cruel, or if the marriage was simply unbearable, Serena would find herself with almost no legal avenues for redress. While some specific laws, like parts of the Justinian Code in the Byzantine East, acknowledged certain extreme circumstances for divorce, they were predominantly difficult for women to invoke and often carried severe social and financial penalties. For instance, a wife divorcing her husband for reasons other than his grave misconduct, like plotting against the emperor, or certain serious crimes, could lose her dowry and face public shame even if a legal mechanism exists. A young girl, likely with no personal property, no independent income, and no male relatives strong enough or willing to challenge her powerful husband, would have no means to pursue legal action. She could not simply walk into a court and present her case. She would need male representation, typically her father or brother, who might be unwilling to risk a feud with her husband's family or face the financial implications of a returned dowry. In many Western European kingdoms, particularly among the Germanic tribes, formal divorce for women was almost non-existent. The concept of a woman leaving her husband was not just legally difficult, it was a profound social taboo. A woman who abandoned her husband, even if he was a tyrant, would be branded an outcast. She would lose her social standing, her reputation would be ruined, and she would likely be disowned by her own family, who would view her as a source of dishonor. There were no societal safety nets for single women, no means of independent support or protection. To be a woman alone in 560 AD meant being vulnerable to exploitation, poverty, and a life of destitution. Imagine the crushing sense of entrapment. You are a child recently married, perhaps facing daily unkindness or neglect. You might dream of returning to your mother's comforting presence, but the path back is blocked by formidable barriers. There is no one to appeal to who holds real power to change your situation. Your complaints might be dismissed as childish tantrums or as the natural difficulties of a young wife adjusting to her duties. Your own family might urge you to be patient, to endure, to fulfill your duty rather than risk bringing shame upon them. This profound lack of rights meant that a young girl's survival and well-being within marriage depended entirely on the benevolence of her husband and his family. If they were kind and just, her life might be bearable, perhaps even happy. But if they were cruel, she was effectively trapped, without a voice, without power, and without any genuine hope of escape. Her marriage vows were a lifelong sentence, with no parole or appeal in sight. The brutal truth was that once you were married, your destiny was sealed, and your personal freedom was an illusion. Number 3. Failing to produce children, especially sons, could lead to social ostracization. In the world of 560, the most profound expectation placed upon a young wife was her fertility. If she failed to produce children, or if she consistently bore only daughters without a son, she faced not just personal disappointment, but severe social ostracization. Her very identity as a woman and a wife was intricately tied to her ability to conceive and bear heirs, making barrenness a devastating blow that could undermine her entire existence within her new family and society. Consider a young girl named Amara, married into a prosperous family in the Persian Sasanian Empire, a formidable rival to the Byzantine East. Her new family is large and influential, and the continuation of their lineage is paramount. Amara tries to conceive, but month after month, year after year, no pregnancy occurs. Or perhaps she bears several daughters, but no sons. The atmosphere in the household would slowly shift. The initial warmth and welcome might turn into coldness, whispers, and thinly veiled disappointment. The social pressure was immense. In many cultures of the era, the failure to conceive was almost universally blamed on the woman. While medical understanding was rudimentary, the idea that a man could be infertile was rarely considered. The fault lay with the wife. This meant that the inability to have children was not a shared problem, but a personal failing of the young wife, a mark of her inadequacy. Her mother-in-law, her sisters-in-law, and even her husband might begin to treat her differently, viewing her as an incomplete or defective wife. The consequences could be severe. In some societies, if a wife failed to produce children, a husband might be culturally or even legally permitted to take a second wife or a concubine specifically for the purpose of procreation. While the legality of polygamy varied, it was generally forbidden in Christianized Byzantine society, but practiced in other regions like the Sasanian Empire. The social pressure for a man to ensure an heir often led to such arrangements, leaving the first wife sidelined and humiliated. She might be forced to endure her husband's other relationships, watching another woman bear the children she could not. Even if a second marriage was not sought, a barren wife's status within the household would diminish significantly. She might be relegated to a lesser position, treated with disdain, or excluded from important family decisions. Her worth in the eyes of her husband's family, which was initially tied to her potential for procreation, would plummet. She might be seen as a burden rather than an asset, a woman who had failed in her fundamental duty. Imagine the profound shame and despair. A young girl, perhaps still struggling with the physical demands of her new life, now carries the additional burden of societal condemnation for something often beyond her control. The inability to conceive or to bear a son could lead to a life of quiet suffering, overshadowed by the constant judgment and the ever-present threat of replacement or abandonment. She might feel isolated, a failure in her own eyes and in the eyes of everyone around her. Her worth as a human being became dependent on her reproductive success, and if that success did not materialize, her future within her marriage and within society was bleak indeed. Number 2. Royal and noble girls were political pawns, not individuals. For girls born into royal or noble families in 560, an arranged marriage transcended personal economic advantage. It became a brutal instrument of statecraft. These young women were not just daughters or individuals. They were living political pawns, strategic assets to be deployed in grand alliances, peace treaties, or territorial expansions. Their personal feelings, desires, or even their physical safety were utterly secondary to the larger Gale game. Consider the life of a young princess, perhaps named Constantia, growing up within the sophisticated imperial court of Constantinople. From the moment she was born, her future was being shaped by the needs of the Byzantine Empire. Her marriage might be arranged to solidify a shaky peace with the Lombards in Italy, to forge a new alliance with the Franks in Gaul, or to appease a powerful chieftain on the empire's eastern frontier. She would be educated in courtly etiquette, languages, and diplomacy, not for her own intellectual curiosity, but to make her a more effective and appealing ambassador for her empire in a foreign court. The negotiation for such a marriage would be intensely complex, involving ambassadors, enormous dowries, and detailed clauses about succession, religious practices, and military aid. Princess herself would be a silent object of these discussions, her fate debated by powerful men in distant throne rooms. She might be married to a man she had never seen, whose reputation was only known through carefully vetted reports. He could be old, infirm, cruel, or even a barbaric pagan, depending on the strategic necessity. Her personal happiness was not a factor in these high-stakes calculations. Imagine the immense pressure and isolation. A young royal girl knew from an early age that her destiny was not her own. She might be sent hundreds or thousands of miles from her home to a foreign land with different customs, a different language, and a new, potentially hostile court. She would be under constant scrutiny, her every action analyzed for its political implications. Her primary duty would be to bear strong, healthy sons who could inherit her husband's throne and, in doing so, secure the alliance that her marriage represented. Failure to produce male heirs could destabilize kingdoms, making her position even more precarious. There were instances of young princesses being married off to rulers who were known enemies of their own people, or who were feared for their brutality. Sometimes, these marriages were temporary truces, and the princess found herself caught in the crossfire of renewed hostilities, perhaps even being held captive or executed if the alliance broke down. Their lives were rarely their own, constantly influenced by the ebb and flow of power, wars, and diplomatic maneuvering. For a royal or noble girl, the brutal truth was that she was a living, breathing commodity, a symbol of power and an instrument of policy. Her body, her fertility, and her very existence were tools in the hands of her male relatives used to secure the future of their dynasty or their realm. She was a pawn on a giant gilded chessboard, and her individual identity was sacrificed for the greater, often brutal game of thrones. Her journey through life was a path laid out not by her own choosing, but by the strategic needs of empires and kingdoms. Number 1. Your marriage was for life, with almost no hope of escape. The most profound and unyielding truth for a young girl entering an arranged marriage in 560 AD was its permanence. This was a lifelong commitment, a bond from which there was almost no hope of escape, regardless of the circumstances. Once you were married, your future was sealed, and the concept of ending a marriage due to unhappiness, incompatibility, or even severe mistreatment was, for a woman, virtually unimaginable and impossible. Consider a young girl named Petronilla from a rural community in Britannia, a land that had seen the Roman legions depart and was now grappling with emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Her marriage to a man from a neighboring settlement was arranged to strengthen local ties and combine small landholdings. Petronilla enters her new home, perhaps at age 14, hoping for a tolerable existence. But what if her husband proves to be a drunkard, or violently abusive, or simply neglectful and unkind? What if her new in-laws are cruel, making her daily life a misery? For Petronilla, there would be no simple way out. In the Christianized parts of the world, including the Byzantine Empire and the burgeoning Christian kingdoms of Western Europe, the sacrament of marriage was viewed as an indissoluble bond forged by God. Divorce, if permitted at all, was extremely rare and reserved for very specific, usually grave offenses, primarily on the part of the husband. And even then, it was a complex and often devastating process for a woman to pursue. For instance, while Byzantine law permitted a woman to seek divorce for her husband's serious crimes, she would still face immense social stigma and financial ruin. The dowry, her only potential source of security, could be lost or difficult to reclaim. Even in regions where local customs or pagan traditions might have offered slightly more flexibility, the practical realities for a woman were insurmountable. To leave your husband meant to lose your social standing, your home, your children, and your economic support. A woman alone had no means of self-sufficiency. She could not own property independently in most places. She had no legal standing without a male guardian, and work opportunities were limited to the most menial and desperate forms of labor. She would be an outcast, a pariah, with nowhere to go and no one to protect her. Imagine the sheer despair of facing such a reality. You are bound for life to a person who might make your existence a constant struggle. Your days are filled with duties, and your nights with fear or loneliness. There is no concept of personal happiness as a valid reason to end a marriage. You are expected to endure, to suffer in silence, and to fulfill your role, no matter how miserable it makes you. Your parents, who arranged the marriage, would likely refuse to take you back, as your return would bring shame and financial repercussions upon their own household. They would urge you to stay, to make the best of it, to pray for patience. This brutal truth meant that many young girls entered marriages that became lifelong prisons. There was no escape hatch, no safety net, no legal or social mechanism to free them from unfortunate circumstances. They were bound by law, by custom, by religion, and by the sheer lack of any alternative. Their marriage vows were not just a promise for a day, but a decree for a lifetime, with all its inherent joys and sorrows, triumphs and tribulations for better or for worse, until death finally granted them release.